There is a kind of man who burns. You have seen him, perhaps you have been him, the one who arrives at every new beginning with a heat so genuine it seems impossible it could ever go cold. And yet it goes cold. It always goes cold. The question that has haunted ambitious men since long before the age of writing is not how to ignite the fire. Any fool can ignite a fire. The question is what separates the man who tends it through every indifferent morning and obstacle and season of doubt from the man who watches it die and tells himself he will light another one soon. Ancient wisdom carries this question the way a river carries sediment, quietly, continuously, shaping everything it touches. And if you find yourself returning to it, it is because the question has recognized something in you. What follows is the story of a man who answered it. Not with words, with mornings. His name was Katsuro, and at 23, he was the most promising student the sword school in Sakai had produced in living memory. This was not flattery. His teacher, a man named Ogata, who had spent 40 years reducing the art of combat to its barest essentials, and who was constitutionally incapable of saying anything he did not mean, had written in a letter to the school's patron that Katsuro possessed a quality of physical intelligence that appeared in a generation perhaps once, maybe twice, and that watching him move through the advanced forms after only 8 months of study was like watching a river find a channel it had been seeking, since before it understood it was seeking anything. Ogata also wrote in the same letter, with the same unflinching economy. The boy cannot finish what he starts. I do not know if this is a flaw of character or a flaw of formation, and in practice the distinction does not matter. Either way, if it is not corrected, everything else is wasted. Katsuro knew this about himself the way a man knows a scar, not by looking at it, but by the way everything around it is slightly altered, the texture of his days shaped by the one thing he could not say, plainly even to himself. He had begun the serious practice of swordsmanship 4 times before arriving at Ogata's school. The first time he was 15, and the dojo master had said, after 6 weeks, that he had never seen a student take to the sword so naturally, and Katsuro had glowed with this for 3 days, and then found reasons to be elsewhere, and the practice had dissolved as completely as smoke. The second time he was 17, and he lasted 11 weeks before an injury that healed in 10 days became the architecture of a much longer retreat. The third time he was 19, the fourth, 21. Each beginning was genuine. Each abandonment was surrounded by reasoning so solid-sounding that he could not, inside it, distinguish it from wisdom. He was a man of remarkable starts and invisible endings, and the pattern had begun to feel like prophecy, as though who he was had already been written, and he was simply performing the text. Ogata sent him away in the autumn of his 23rd year, not in disgrace, but in something more uncomfortable than disgrace, with honesty. He sat Katsuro before him in the training hall after the other students had filed out, with the evening light coming through the wooden slats at an angle that made the dust motes visible and the emptiness of the room feel significant. And he said, "You are the most gifted student I have trained. You are also the one I am most certain will amount to nothing if you continue as you are. These 2 facts are not contradictions. They are the same fact seen from different directions." He paused long enough for this to settle. "I am sending you to a man named Mori. He lives in the mountains above Yoshino. He will either correct what is wrong with you, or he will confirm that it cannot be corrected. And either answer will be worth more to you than another year of spectacular beginnings in my training hall." The journey to Yoshino took 4 days on foot through country that grew increasingly vertical and silent. the kind of silence that does not feel empty, but full, as though the mountains are saying something just beneath the audible range. Katsuro arrived at Mori's compound at dusk on the fourth day to find an old man chopping wood alone in the yard, with the methodical unhurriedness of someone who had been doing this particular thing for so long that the motion had ceased to be an action and had become simply a mode of existing. Mori was 64 years old and had been practicing swordsmanship since he was 6, and had, by the accounts Katsuro had gathered on the road, defeated 17 men in formal combat without once suffering a wound of consequence. He did not look like these accounts. He looked like a man chopping wood. He set down the axe, looked at Katsuro with eyes that assessed without performing assessment, and said only, "You're late. Eat. Sleep. The bell rings at 4. Then he resumed chopping. The bell did ring at 4, and Katsuro learned on that first morning the particular quality of education that a cold room and a body that does not want to rise can provide. He lay on his sleeping mat, listening to the bell fade into the mountain darkness, and heard, very clearly, the voice that he had spent his adult life negotiating with. The voice that was his own voice, rational and measured and full of language that always sounded from inside, more like reasoning than like the retreat it was. He had traveled 4 days. His feet were blistered. Rest was not weakness. Rest was preparation. He would be sharper tomorrow. The practice would benefit from a single day of recovery. He knew this voice the way a man knows a recurring dream, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was so familiar it had become invisible, as much a part of the furniture of his inner life as his own name. He rose because there was nowhere else to go, and in the dark courtyard found Mori already there, already moving through a form so slow and controlled it looked, in the pre-dawn blackness, less like swordsmanship than like weather. Mori trained him differently from anyone who had trained him before, and the difference was not in the content, but in the architecture of repetition. There was one form, just one, a beginner's form. The first form any child learned at any school in the province, a sequence so elementary that Katsuro had mastered it before his first abandonment at 15. He was to perform this form 40 times each morning, following the meditation and the cold water, without variation, without advancement, without the introduction of any more sophisticated sequence, regardless of how ready he felt, or how strongly the repetition of the elementary began to feel like an insult to his actual level. One form, 40 times, every morning. He was told this on his first full day, and he understood immediately, and with a certainty he did not express out loud, that this was the most humbling assignment he had ever received. He had also received enough humbling in his life to know that the humbling that produces resentment is different from the humbling that produces something useful, and that the difference between them was not in the humiliation itself, but in what a man chose to do with it. For the first 5 days, the practice was almost easy in the way that beginnings were always easy for Katsuro. The novelty of the arrangement provided its own energy. The mountains provided their own austerity, and Mori's presence in the pre-dawn dark was a gravitational field that made rising feel less like a choice than like an inevitability. On the 6th day, the novelty had exhausted itself, and what remained was the practice without ornamentation, and Katsuro understood then what Mori had known from the beginning, that the form was never the point. The form was the container. What was being practiced was not the sword. What was being practiced was the returning. On the 9th morning, the negotiation arrived with full force for the first time, and Katsuro lay in the dark and observed it with an attention he had never previously given it. Not because he had become more aware, but because he had nowhere to go and nothing to do but observe. He noticed how the voice assembled itself. It did not arrive complete. It built, piece by piece, from a core of physical discomfort. The blistered feet, the ache across his shoulders from the previous day's work. And around that core it arranged, with the precision of a skilled builder, a structure of reasons. Each reason was real. None of the individual pieces were dishonest. The whole edifice, he saw now with a clarity he had not previously had, was a lie. Not a lie in its components, but a lie in its intention. A construction whose purpose was not to arrive at truth, but to arrive at stopping, to make stopping feel indistinguishable from wisdom. He rose. He washed his face in the water that was cold enough in the mountain autumn to be a shock and a clarification simultaneously. He performed the form 40 times, and standing in the dark after the 40th repetition, breathing visible in the cold air, he felt something he could not have named, but that he recognized by its absence of drama. A small, quiet solidity, like a single stone placed correctly. Mori spoke rarely and never about the sword. He spoke about water and stone and seasons and the behavior of fire, and a man who had not been paying careful attention might have spent weeks in his company without realizing that every conversation was about the same thing. 2 weeks into the practice, sitting in the evenings with tea that Mori prepared with the same meticulous care he brought to everything. The water temperature precise, the measurement unhurried, the attention total. The old man said without preamble, "You have noticed the voice." It was not a question. Katsuro said, "I have noticed it." "How long have you been negotiating with it?" "Since I can remember." Mori nodded slowly. "And how has the negotiating served you?" The question had no comfortable answer. "It has kept me warm on cold mornings," Katsuro said finally, "and cold on every morning after." The old man smiled. A rare event, brief and unperformed. The smile of a man who recognizes something he once lived. "The voice is not your enemy," he said. "You have spent years treating it as an enemy, which is why it has continued to defeat you. It is not your enemy. It is simply an older version of you, the you that was formed before you understood what you were building toward when comfort was the most sophisticated goal available. You cannot defeat it by opposing it. You can only outlast it by becoming someone it no longer recognizes." He drank his tea. That is what the practice is for, not the sword. The becoming. On the 22nd day, a merchant's party passed through the mountain path below the compound, a group of prosperous men traveling with attendants and the comfortable noise of people who live without austerity. And one of the merchants, a man who recognized Katsuro from Sakai and who called up to him with genuine warmth, invited him down to share a meal and the kind of easy-flowing conversation that Katsuro had always been good at, and had always, if he was honest, preferred to the discipline of any practice. He felt the pull of this so strongly that it was almost physical. Not the merchant specifically, not the meal specifically, but the self that the invitation was extending toward. The charming, capable, well-liked Katsuro, who was extraordinary in company and mediocre in practice, and who had been, for most of his life, perfectly content to trade one for the other, because the company always confirmed what the practice would have challenged. He cupped his hands and called down, "I rise at 4. I cannot stay awake late enough to be worth your company." The merchant looked puzzled. Then he shrugged, and the party moved on, and the mountain was quiet again, and Katsuro stood at the compound gate and noticed something unusual. He did not feel deprived. He felt, of all things, intact. The 30th day brought a fever that arrived in the night and had established itself thoroughly by the time the bell rang at 4. He lay on his mat, conducting the inventory that an honest man conducts, not performing wellness to himself in the hope that belief would follow, not catastrophizing the symptoms in the direction of a necessary rest, but simply assessing, how unwell am I, and what does that permit? He was genuinely unwell. He was also, he determined, not so unwell that movement was impossible. He rose, he washed his face, which the fever made feel both too hot and too cold at once. He sat in meditation for the 20 minutes that the practice required, and the fever provided a distorted and unhelpful presence throughout, a kind of inner weather that made the usual practice of stillness feel like trying to hear a quiet voice in a noisy room. Then he performed the form, slowly, imperfectly, each movement carried with the deliberate care of a man transporting something fragile across uncertain ground. It was the worst iteration of the form in 30 days. He understood when it was finished that it was also the most important. He understood this not because suffering had instructed him, he had never believed in the romance of suffering as a teacher, but because he had just written something into himself that could not be unwritten. The practice was not a fair weather arrangement. It was not a compact he had made with ideal conditions that released him when conditions became non-ideal. It was a thing he was, and a thing he was did not require conditions in order to be it. A river in drought is still a river. It does not suspend being a river until the rains return. It moves with what it has, in the channel it has cut, toward the direction it has always been moving. And when the rains come, it is still a river. The same river, continuous, with no gap in its riverness into which a different nature might have settled. He was beginning to understand, on the 30th morning, in the fever and the cold and the imperfect execution of a beginner's form, that this was what Mori had been building from the beginning. Not a swordsman, a river. The 45th day brought an internal obstacle, which was harder than any external one. He woke at 4 in a state of what could only be described as profound indifference. Not fatigue, not illness, not resistance, but a flatness so complete that the practice seemed to offer nothing, to mean nothing, to connect to nothing in him that could recognize it as worthwhile. He had read about this state. Every text he had encountered that was honest about long-term practice described it. The desert through which every sustained effort eventually passes, the territory where neither the early fire nor any obvious reward is present, where only the bare fact of the commitment remains, and the commitment must sustain itself entirely on its own terms, without support from enthusiasm or result or the visible sense of progress. He performed the form in the flat grey light of that morning, with the quality of a man performing a task in an empty room with no audience and no feeling of significance. And at the end of it, folding the practice away into the day, he noticed something. It had been done. The indifference had not prevented it. The absence of feeling had not been the absence of action. He had moved through the desert without stopping, not because the desert had become pleasant, but because he had learned, morning by morning, that his movement did not require the desert's permission. It was on the 63rd morning that Mori watched him perform the form, and then stood in silence for a long moment before speaking. "You are different from the man who arrived here." Katsuro said nothing, because it was not a question. "Tell me what changed." Katsuro thought about this with the care the question deserved. He had thought about it many times in the preceding weeks, turning it the way a man turns a stone in his hand, examining each face of it. I thought at first that I was developing willpower, he said. That I was becoming stronger in some way that would allow me to overcome the resistance I had always failed to overcome before. He paused. But I don't think that is what happened. No, Mori said. What do you think happened? I think I became someone for whom the question of whether to continue does not arise, Katsuro said carefully. Not because I suppressed the question, but because I performed the actions of a man for whom it was not a question every morning until those actions and that man became the same thing. The practice did not strengthen me. It replaced me, gradually, without ceremony. The way the river does not strengthen its banks, it wears away everything that is not the riverbed until only the riverbed remains. And then the water flows in the only direction available, which is the direction it was always going to flow. He stopped, slightly surprised by his own words. Mori looked at him steadily. Now, the old man said, we can begin. What followed was the education Katsuro had come for, though he understood now that the preceding 63 days had been as much a part of it as anything that followed. Mori introduced new forms, not to replace the morning practice, but to exist alongside it, layered on the foundation the first 100 mornings were building. And now something remarkable became apparent. The forms that would have consumed Katsuro with enthusiasm for a week and then been abandoned arrived in a different soil than they had ever arrived in before. They were received not by the part of him that ran hot at beginnings and cold at middles, but by something deeper and steadier. The part of him that now rose at 4, because rising at 4 was what he was, and received each new teaching the way the ground receives rain. Not with excitement, which would have been followed by drought, but with absorption, which is followed by growth. He thought often, in these months, of the young men he had known in Sakai, the ones who had talked with him about ambition and swordsmanship, and the life of a man who had truly mastered something. He had been one of them, burning with that talk, full of the vocabulary of mastery, and entirely innocent of its substance. He knew what they were doing now, those men. They were beginning things. They were abandoning things. They were assembling sophisticated reasons for abandonment that sounded, from inside those reasons, like wisdom. They were becoming, with each cycle, more fluent in the language of starting over and more distant from the territory that only continuous practice could reach. He did not feel superior to them. He had been them too recently, and too completely for superiority. He felt, if anything, a kind of sorrow that was also compassion, the particular feeling of a man who has been lost in a place and then found the way out and then looked back at the territory that was once so confusing and seen, from the outside, how unnecessary the confusion was, how close the path had always been, how available it had always been to anyone willing to stop performing the search and begin the walking. In his second year on the mountain, a young man arrived who reminded Katsuro so precisely of himself at 23 that it was almost uncomfortable. The same quality of heat at the beginning, the same fluency with the language of dedication, the same obvious talent that arrived alongside an equally obvious history of interruption. Katsuro watched Mori receive him with the same economy with which Mori received everything. The assessment without performance, the assignment of the single elementary form, the morning bell at 4. He watched the young man, whose name was Daiichi, burned through the first days with the familiar propulsive energy, and then, on the 7th morning, watched him fail to rise when the bell rang. He heard Mori's sandals in the hall. He heard the door. He heard Mori's voice, even and without judgment. The bell rang. He heard Daiichi's voice, young, defensive, constructing its architecture of reasons. He heard silence. Then he heard the door, and then 2 sets of footsteps moving toward the courtyard, and then the sound of a young man performing a form in the dark because there was nowhere else to go. He recognized all of it with a recognition that went below memory into something closer to the body's own record, the deep cellular knowing of a man who has lived in the same country. He was permitted to speak to Daichi on the 31st day, after the young man's practice had reached a particular threshold that Mori measured in ways Katsuro had learned to trust without fully understanding. He sat with the young man in the evening with tea that Katsuro now prepared himself with something approaching Mori's attention, though he understood it would be years before the gap closed, and he said, "You are waiting for it to feel different." Daichi looked at him. Is that obvious? Only to a man who waited for it himself for many years. He poured carefully. It will not feel different in the way you are hoping for. There is no morning that arrives with the quality of revelation you are imagining. No moment where the discipline suddenly ceases to cost anything, and the practice simply flows. What happens is subtler and stranger and more permanent than that. What happens is that you change. Not your feelings about the practice, you. And the changed version of you finds the practice available in the way that a river finds its channel available. Not because the channel has become easier, but because the river has become the thing that moves in channels. And that is simply what it does now, and the doing of it requires nothing beyond the being of it. He paused, looking at the tea. The fire you arrived with is real. Do not trust it the way you have been trusting it. Trust it the way you would trust a match, as the thing that starts the flame, not the thing that sustains it. The sustaining is different work, quieter work, less visible, more permanent. Daichi asked him, with the directness of a young man who has not yet learned to be embarrassed by direct questions, "How do you stop the voice? The one that tells you to stop?" Katsuro considered this. "You don't stop it," he said. "You outlast it. You stop engaging with it, which is different from stopping it. The voice argues. An argument requires 2 parties. When you rise without argument, not suppressing the argument, but simply not entering it, moving toward the cold water, the way water moves toward the lowest point, which is the direction of its nature and requires no decision, the voice loses the only thing that sustains it, which is your attention. It does not disappear, but over time it becomes irrelevant in the way that a merchant selling something you have no use for becomes irrelevant, not suppressed, not defeated, simply not a party to the transactions of your actual life. He drank his tea. The practice builds slowly, a self for whom the voice is speaking a language that no longer applies. It is still fluent in the language of the man you used to be. You simply stop being that man, one morning at a time, until you look back at the language and realize you have forgotten how to speak it. His 3rd year brought him back down the mountain, not because Mori released him, but because Mori never held anyone. The compound had no walls and no obligation, only the practice and the bell, and the understanding that those who were ready to leave would leave, and those who were not would understand that about themselves in the leaving. He returned to Sakai, not with the particular pride of a man who has accomplished something dramatic, but with the particular quiet of a man who has become something that does not require announcement. He opened a small training hall in the quarter of the city, where the young men with ambition and interrupted histories gathered, the ones whose talent was genuine and whose pattern was recognizable, and who had come to the understanding, sometimes early, sometimes only after years of the same cycle. that knowing what to do and being able to do it without ceasing were separated by a distance that information couldn't cross. He did not teach them what he knew. He gave them what Ogata had given him, what Mori had given him, not explanation, but structure, not understanding, but practice, specific and repeatable and continuous, small enough to survive bad mornings and fever, and the visit of old friends, and the days of profound indifference when the practice seems to mean nothing and must sustain itself entirely on its own terms. He gave them the bell at 4. He gave them the cold water and the elementary form and the single instruction that was the whole of the teaching, even if it required years to understand. Do not stop. Not because stopping is forbidden. Because stopping is where the old self lives. And the old self will recognize you when you arrive there and welcome you back with the warmth of something familiar. And the longer you stay, the more you will remember why you used to live there. And the more you remember, the harder the returning becomes. The practice is not a path to somewhere. The practice is somewhere. It is the only somewhere that has what you are looking for. Everything else, the planning, the reading, the conversation about ambition and the future and the man you intend to become, is the talking about the somewhere. The talking is not the going. The going begins at 4, in the dark, before the reasons can assemble, in the motion from sleep to rising, that must eventually become not a decision, but a nature. The same single motion, until the bell and the rising are one thing, and the one thing is you. He kept a basin in the courtyard of his training hall in Sakai, filled with mountain water, positioned where the morning light reached it first. Students who noticed it and asked about it received the same answer he had received when he first asked Mori about the basin at the mountain compound. Not an explanation, but a direction. Sit with it. Watch what it does. He would leave them there, sometimes for an hour, and come back to find most of them restless, and a few of them still. The ones who were still were the ones in whose faces he could see the beginning of the understanding. Not grasped, not articulated, but present in the quality of their attention, the way a root is present underground, invisible and foundational, and doing, without ceremony, the only work that makes anything above it possible. The basin received the morning and held it without deciding how much to hold. The morning changed, and the basin received the change without preference. The clouds moved, and the light moved, and the basin moved with all of it, continuously, without interruption, which was the teaching, and the only teaching, offered every morning to anyone with the patience to receive it. Not in words, not in the language of explanation, but in the quiet and total evidence of a surface that simply, without drama, without recognition, without the need for any audience at all, kept on. There is a kind of man the world does not fully account for, not the most talented, not the most loudly ambitious, not the one whose gifts are obvious in the first week of any endeavor. He is the one who is still there, still at the practice, still at the bell, still at the cold water and the elementary form and the unremarkable daily repetition that has become, over years of unbroken mornings, the deepest fact about who he is. He does not look like what the young imagine mastery looks like. He looks, from the outside, like a man performing ordinary tasks. From the inside, he is something that cannot be explained with the vocabulary of motivation or discipline or willpower, because none of those words reach deep enough. He is simply and permanently, and without drama or ceremony or the need for anyone's acknowledgement, what he has practiced being long enough that the practicing and the being have become the same word, spoken in the same breath, in the same dark, at the same unremarkable and absolute hour, when the bell rings and the only answer that the years of mornings have left available is the one that was always the only real answer: to rise.